Right, settle in, get comfortable. We have a live panel for you now. So as you watch, type in your questions as well, your thoughts and your opinions. We're going to concentrate now on network slicing. And George, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Sasha, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to my panelists. Let me just introduce who I've got with me today. I've got Greg Tilton, the CEO of Digit Systems, in the top right. I've got Doug McCullough, who's the CIO of Dublin City, Ohio. And I have to say Ohio because it's not Dublin City in Ireland, where I'm from. We've got Alla Goldner, chair of the ONAP Subcommittee on the Linux Foundation, top left, and Dan Warren, Director of Advanced Network Research from Samsung Electronics. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to my panelists. You're very welcome. This morning, we're actually looking at network as a service and network slicing, looking at how operators and customers can own the opportunity. And we're going to start to look at private enterprise networks. And I really just want to kick off by actually exploring, we're talking about network slicing and network as a service, and I'm going to go straight to Greg and I'll actually say, will the slicing and the network as a service change the marketplace, and what impact will it have on the role of the telco?
Oh, that's an interesting question, George. The telco role, I guess, is a little bit up for grabs with network slicing and the advent of 5G. I guess that 5G does things like increases the density of mobile towers significantly. The requirement to get the radio is much closer to the customer. I think there's opportunities for collaborations between enterprises, between building owners, and between cities even, with telcos in relation to 5G and leveraging the ability of the technology to virtualize. And there's that virtualization goes a little further. There's with virtualization of the network functions, there's all sorts of opportunities to then start to converge network slices with application functions and edge running on edge compute, etc.
Okay, Greg, so you're introducing some interesting concepts around network slicing, around edge functions. Now, clearly we need some standards in that area, and Alla, working in the Linux Foundation, you're very familiar with open source technology and open standards. How can the Linux Foundation and the work that you're doing there help us in this space around network slicing and the network as a service capabilities that we're talking about?
Yeah, so we actually started the work on network slicing use case quite a long time ago, several releases ago from Dublin release, and each release that we work on, we advance the capability. We started from some of the capabilities related to the domain management. We enhanced it to the end-to-end network slicing. I would also like to end also as an orchestration lead in the open core network stream of TIP. We also there define network slicing as the key use case, and as a fact, starting from the phase 2, we will be closely looking into private enterprise network as a specific case of network slicing for service providers. Now, I would also like to add on top of that any technology is fine and nice, but it only comes into the game or into the life once there is a right monetization strategy for that. And private enterprise networks based on network slicing service provider each other one recognize that, and starting from the 16 and now in through normative standardization, there is actually a standardization on how network slice manager and SMF reports becomes a charge and trigger functions and report on slice consumption to the charging function. So the charging would basically not only be possible to be done on the mobile subscriber level, but in general on slice consumption and on the service experience. And that really opens a lot of new use cases and monetization strategy for service providers in their communication with the enterprises. And only then that there is a new monetization strategy, and service providers clearly see that they can get a return on their investment, and enterprise also see that they can really get those slices with those parameters that they need for their network, that will happen.
So Alla has been talking about private enterprise networks, and Dan, I want to bring you in because whenever we were having a conversation about this previously, you were talking about the work that you've been doing in the ICT space around private enterprise networks and how you are delivering solutions to customers. Can you just elaborate on that in terms of how network slicing and network as a service plays into the private enterprise network space from an ICT solution perspective?
Well, clearly, when you move into network slicing, you have a network which can be partitioned, and pieces of that can be allocated to specific customers. It gives you a real strong direction which B2B type customers in the enterprise domain may wish to pick up on. I think there's kind of many different variants that can be adopted where an enterprise could take an entire slice from a network and essentially just locate radio access network points, so just base stations within their enterprise domain, through to something where the components of the network which are owned by the enterprise and held on site can be almost the entire network, or indeed the entire network owned and operated by the enterprise themselves. And then the role of the network operator is greater or smaller depending upon which one of those variants is picked up. But I think the direction that Alla was going in with her answer is an interesting one, because the commercialization of all of that technology is probably the biggest challenge right now. We've spent a lot of time in a range of standards forums defining how network slicing works, making particular provisions for what are referred to as non-private networks. But the challenge is a shift in mindset for operators from what has always been a B2C commercial proposition towards one which is B2B or B2B2C, where immediately you have that additional B in the middle. The operator always acts as the first B, and the enterprise customer is the second B, and as a result, the price charged by the operator is a cost in the enterprise's business case. And as a result, the commercial pressure of that, and also the associated SLAs and KPIs which need to be supported, and the service assurance that needs to go with that, means that the technical implementation of network slicing would need to be very robust and need to have an awful lot of network capacity sitting behind it, because B2B contracts tend to be a lot more onerous and a lot more risk averse than B2C ones.
Thank you, Dan, and we'll come back to some of those very technical concepts in a minute. But I want to go and talk to Doug now about some of the work that they're doing in Dublin City. Doug, you're the CIO of a city. You're trying to deliver services, presumably to the residents or citizens of that city. And you've got all of these technology partners and operators coming, throwing network as a service, network slicing, and all sorts of technology at you. But as one of these either B's or the C's in the B2B2C that Dan was talking about, how do you see the role as the CIO of the city in actually consuming 5G services, network slicing, or network as a service? And how do you present that to your citizens and your residents in the city that you're responsible for?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's interesting because we have a lot of complexity with regard to deploying some of these technologies and services. On the one hand, we have always had a significant amount of very large enterprises who utilize many of these services themselves, and we want to enable them and give them many of the resources that are important for them to do that. On the other hand, we have citizens that carriers and other enterprises are attempting to serve with their services. And then on yet another hand, if I can have three hands, we have our own activities and services as a smart city. So we have gone from being a standard local government to being somewhat of a small enterprise ourselves. And the services that we are delivering to residents and citizens are more indirect. So residents are not paying necessarily for those services, but we have things like smart parking and smart mobility and those kinds of things which are dependent upon our effective use of these networks. I do think that we are still immature as a market with regard to some of these services and how the business models will play out. But those are the major arenas in which we find we have to operate. And the questions that our citizens have are significantly different from our large enterprises. Citizens are more interested in the equipment being invisible and hidden. They are more concerned about the effectiveness of the service that they are receiving. So it's very complex in delivering a single, more standardized set of services that both enterprises, residents, and we as a smart city can all utilize. And it requires putting a lot of different kinds of things together.
Thank you, Doug. And Greg, I know that you've been working on catalysts in the TM forum and actually demonstrating some smart city solutions with the work that you've been doing on Digit Systems. And hearing whenever Doug's saying about how they want services, yet we obviously very often fall back to talking about technology and talking about network slicing and all sorts of things. How do you make that leap, or how do you make that transition from the deep technical services that we're building and solutions that we're building and actually make those into services that are consumable by the B or the C customers that Doug is trying to serve through the Dublin City in Ohio?
Yes, well, it's I'll steal a term from my new friend Dan here, network splicing, where you've really got to put together different components to make a complete service. And you mentioned the catalyst. So Doug here is our champion on the Smart Networks for Smart Cities catalyst, which is being led by Fujitsu, and Digit Systems has the pleasure of being one of the participants in that catalyst. But we've been splicing different types of services together, not just network services, essentially. So we combine some edge compute with a 5G network slice, with some video analytics and an application service to meet some of the smart parking requirements of Doug's as the champion. And there's an actual live field test in behind it as well in the city of Ohio. So it's pretty city of Dublin, sorry. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Being how you would go about combining all of those different technology components to form something useful. And there's a lot of different techniques for combining these services. There's you can when we combine a service and say you take an order for a service, then you need to break it into its parts, and you could be breaking that into its part. We call that decomposition, and there's a number of different sorts of relationships you could use in decomposition. It could be an aggregation of different services. It could be a composition relationship, or it could be what we call a realization relationship. They've all got there's different ways of stitching these different things together, and you need to be able to do that quite dynamically to leverage all the capabilities of all of these technologies.
So you mentioned network splicing, and this was a term whenever we were actually going through some of the questions that Dan came up with. Dan, do you want to elaborate on your network splicing and where it came from and the thought that led up to that?
Yeah, so I worked in telecoms for about I guess about 15 years, and then for whatever reason I tried to escape for about 2 years out into more of, I guess, a system integration and outsourcing company. And in those 2 years, we spent a lot of time responding to RFIs and RFQs, which were a bunch of different kinds of enterprise customers who really didn't care what G or what technology it was that provided them the solution. They had a set of KPIs, a set of SLAs, a certain amount of money that they were prepared to pay to connect devices and services together. And the service set that they were asking for wasn't any one single thing. It was connect all of my sales staff, all of my supply chain, all of my retail outlets, all of my payment points, and do it for this amount of money a month, so I don't need to worry about it. And then the part which hung underneath that, which is kind of back to the risk associated with this, was if it doesn't work, if you don't deliver the SLAs and the KPIs which I want, tell me who I ring and how much money I get back. And so the concept of splicing was that it was never a single solution. It was never, okay, so 5G solves everything. It was always, well, you need a combination of different sets of KPIs and SLAs, different sets of services. And when you talk to customers about that, they don't even want to know that level of detail. They just say, well, we'll make it work. Don't tell me about the technology. That's why I'm paying you. You work out how the technology works and tell me how much I need to pay. And if it's the right amount of money, then I'll say yes. And if it's the wrong amount of money, then I'll say no. And it's that shift in mindset, because you've got to get off the page of trying to sell the technology and actually sell the overall service composition. And the service composition as a whole is made up of multiple parts, which is where lots and lots of network slices need to be combined back together to make a single offering.
Thank you, Dan. And actually, just picking up on that point, and I'm going to come to Doug on this one. So Dan was saying, he wasn't actually asked to sell the technology. He wanted to sell the solution. But you find yourself in a technology role as the CIO of Dublin City, and you must be meeting operators and vendors who are trying to sell you technology, but presumably you're trying to explain to the city mayor or the financial controller the benefit of this technology and how it will actually facilitate or improve the lives of your citizens. How do you do that translation from the technical depth of network slices and 5G and all of those sorts of technologies to the sort of services that Dan's talking about that says, if it doesn't work, who do I phone? Potentially it's you, Doug, for my refund whenever I don't have my smart lighting or my smart car parking working. How do you bridge that gap as a CIO working in a city?
This is a very interesting line of discussion, and I was nodding my head a lot as Dan was talking, and Greg as well, because we are interested in the technology, but not that interested. And so we have a similar kind of situation as many large enterprises. The best of breed technical vendor for a intersection, for traffic and for smart mobility, for camera analytics, counting cars going through an intersection, and that edge compute kind of architecture may not be the same best of breed when it comes to smart parking, may not be the same best of breed in a smart building, or the best one to connect us as a city to an enterprise we're interested in sharing a service that way. We may have dozens of different technical architectures that we are interested in. And so the level of orchestration and automation that's important from my perspective as a CIO is very, very important. When it comes to speaking to a mayor or a city council or residents, we can't make certain mistakes when it comes to, we can't just come after the fact and say there was a horrible crash in the intersection because your network latency wasn't at the SLA that we expected. That's unacceptable. And so our catalyst is really around the kind of mission criticality that is involved with choosing the best of breed technology and then having a network layer and sort of orchestration kind of architecture that allows us to never, ever have to go to a vendor and say, you didn't quite meet your SLA, because that means that our emergency services and things like that didn't work. Our mayor and people who we are accountable to, they are interested in things like extremely high reliability, but are not so much concerned about what kind of edge compute scenario you're dealing with. So I would prefer and typically do, we do not want a single technology architecture across the entire enterprise so that we have the simplicity and comfort of just going back to one vendor. We would rather have 10 different best of breed technologies, and our one vendor is really our data layer and our control layer that we must get absolutely right, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, Doug. And just to build on that point, then I'll come to Alla for. We can't come to Alla. We've lost her connection. I was going to ask about uh, uh, standards then in terms of if you're going to have 10 solution providers. Greg, I'll throw it to you because I know that you work heavily in this space. So
Actually,
if you've got.
George, before we get
Yeah,
to that, maybe
yeah, sure.
just to elaborate a little bit on some of the things that that Doug said. There's those of us from a networking background would be familiar with protected circuits and the idea of having connectivity that's a really high availability through having diverse paths. And in this particular use case, in the smart networks for smart cities use case, we extend the concept of protected circuits and into including protection for the edge compute. So there's not just path diversity and a protected path per se, but there's failover of compute resources where there are different compute resources at the edge that are accessible through different paths. So so to maintain the types of availability that are required for this sort of video analytics, it adds a whole new dimension to that diverse path protected circuit redundancy part of the problem. So there's some pretty
So,
interesting
Greg, just to build
technology
on
things.
that, because
And George, I think you're about to ask me about standards.
yeah, well, I was just going to build on what you've actually talked about because you've actually gone into a lovely area around network as a service and actually talking about assured paths and actually so what Doug wants is an assured path. He wants a guaranteed service. He's not actually specifying that he wants a 4G connection or a 5G connection or a private circuit connection. He's actually describing an intent from the customer's perspective. And he wants us as operators, as solution providers, to actually deliver that intent against an SLA or an SLG. And I think, Dan, you have talked about this whenever you've talked about your solutions and the whole concept of building solutions out of a set of interoperable network services, but not necessarily, and obviously beneath the scenes or behind the scenes, you will understand the technology as to how you're delivering it. But from a customer perspective, Doug is much more interested in the assured service or the guaranteed service that you're going to deliver him from your private enterprise network. Is that something that you're seeing more often now as the maturity of the customers develops and they start to ask more probing questions about the solutions that you're going to provide?
Is that to me?
Yes, Dan.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we do see it more, but then equally, when the customer is a network operators don't want networks that fail. They want networks that are resilient as well. So whilst what you get with a B2C contract, what you get as a customer with a mobile phone in your hand, as a private citizen, is not a not a great deal in terms of particular guarantees of service when it comes down to contractual obligation. You do have an expectation that the network is resilient and it's there most of the time. And when networks fail, that's when we see significant levels of customer churn moving from one operator to another. So the vendor and the operator already have a requirement to build resilient networks, and resilience in itself includes physical layer hardware and path redundancy. But increasingly, as we move more and more towards softwarization of networks in general, the way that you build resilience into small hubs, small data centers, or increasingly back into cloud-based networks is fundamentally changing. So you can shift from having specific functions tied to specific hardware, and if a particular piece of hardware fails, then that piece of functionality is disabled. So being able to quite dynamically reallocate network functions to different pieces of hardware because the hardware is common and becomes just a compute platform which is highly distributed. And as a result, the network resilience is built around that softwarization and the reorchestration of the network on the fly. All of those things work well when it comes to enabling enterprise customers to get a higher level of resilience. The challenge then, it comes back to this point around moving things towards the edge of the network. The closer you move things towards the subscriber and towards the subscriber edge of the network, you get back to the point of moving more towards hardware dependency, because you don't want to have a model which previously might have been a small number of tens or a really low number of hundreds of data centers towards many thousands, which are highly distributed. Because a highly distributed, fully redundant hardware platform is a lot bigger than a centralized, fully redundant hardware platform. You move from a very large N+1 or N+a few redundancy model to one which goes back to almost being 1-to-1 or 1+1, which then moves you from a small percentage of redundant hardware to a completely fully redundant 50% increment on the network build. So, as we build out more and more in terms of network architecture, which needs to have that level of resilience and also move things towards network edge, whether that's for non-public network basis or for really low latency services which are operational within the operator domain. We're shifting ourselves perpetually from software dependency to hardware dependency and back again. And the orchestration layer that sits on top of all of that and manages it becomes increasingly complex and increasingly important to manage in the way that Greg was describing as well.
Okay, great, Dan. And I'm going to just go back to the studio and link up with Sasha again. I think maybe we've got a couple of questions, or we can get a question from the studio, Sasha.
Absolutely. George, thank you very much. Incidentally, we're running a poll at the moment as well, looking at the future of this particular subject. So do click into the poll and send your questions over. Doug, got a really interesting one for you, actually. We're talking about the finances here, and we were hearing a lot about the city of Dublin, Ohio. Do residents pay when you're trying to work out the finances here, or do residents consider this sort of thing you were talking about with the smart cities, the smart parking and the like of it? Do they consider this as now it's a right and therefore it's just too late to charge? So actually you've got to look at that finance model in a different way. And also, do you have any citizens groups when you're putting in this infrastructure? Do you discuss with residents, how does that work? What is the feedback from people living within the community as to what they want? I'm just interested to know where the direction of travel comes from. And Greg, also one to you. What's the biggest lesson you've learnt when combining services? You were talking a lot about how you've been doing that, but maybe the biggest lesson you've learnt. George, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Sasha. So Doug, a great question for you from Sasha from the audience.
Yeah, it is a great question. And you can almost see both of these things forming up for cities. On the one hand, yes, citizens and residents do expect better automation, the application of smart technologies without paying extra. They expect that it's considered good administration, good operations. We are expected to consistently and constantly improve without returning to them and saying, well, yes, we can make your intersection safer, but that's going to cost you more. That's not really how you do things. The other side of it, though, is that we are constantly looking for opportunities to monetize these technologies, the data that's come from them. And that is a conversation with the public to talk about, is that okay? Are we going to be okay now with the new kinds of data that are available that potentially can fund the innovations that we're seeing happen? To the second part of the question, we do have outreach to citizens. We have a technology advisory group in the city of Dublin, and we approach them and we say, this is what we're considering doing. This is what is in flight. These are some initiatives that we're not sure of. There are data privacy concerns. There are cost concerns. What are your comments? And we are blessed to have a number of technology executives, CIOs, CTOs, security officers who can advise us because they happen to be residents of the city of Dublin. So I have more than a dozen people who we regularly go to and ask for feedback about these things. And often citizen reaction is more of a barrier than cost. And so that communication layer with the public is extremely important.
Excellent, Doug. Thank you. And the people aspect of the network solution being brought in there. Greg, Sasha had a question for you about the orchestration of these services and the complexity. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes, so I guess the lessons on combining services are firstly to start with services that are built to be kind of autonomous and reusable. So if each of the service components can be designed to be autonomous and reusable, then you can move to a catalog-driven model where you can use a catalog to then combine those services into composite services, and and one thing we find is that change is inevitable, and you combine things one way, and then next week there'll be some smart marketing person that will want to combine them in a different way, and you don't you if you model things to be autonomous and reusable, then you put yourself in the position where you can be agile and responsive to market demands, and avoid unnecessary IT cycles, avoid getting into IT projects unnecessarily.
Excellent, Greg. I'm going to try and bring Alla in again. Apologies, Alla, we've been having problems with your broadband, but we've got you. Yesterday, when we were talking about this, we were talking about end-to-end serviceability and how standards could help in this space. And Greg's been now talking about the orchestration and lessons learned from the orchestration of many services. With the work that you're doing at the Linux Foundation, how are you helping with this end-to-end serviceability problem?
Yeah, so, with the introduction of functionalities such as network slicing, it is very important to realize that unlike in the previous generation, then basically the management was done on the layer of domain in RAN, in core, in transport separately. It is basically the end-to-end network orchestration or management of network slices, which assures the providing the standing against SLA for those services and actually providing service, end-to-end service with the quality which is needed by the subscribers. So this is what we call horizontal integration. And there is also, of course, vertical integration from BSS through the layer of end-to-end OSS or CSMF, NSMF in terms of standardization, and then into the domain layers down NSSMFs of each one of those domains. All these functionalities, as Dan has mentioned, is a bit a complex system, right? It is not something easy to build, and there are quite a few standardization efforts in this regard. Some of them are separate. For instance, there are some in 3GPP for RAN and core slicing standardization and private networks standardization. There is one going on in ITF on transport slicing standardization. There are quite a few in the ETSI, ZSM, in TIM forum, and so on. And, organizations such as Linux Foundation with its effort in ONAP on end-to-end slicing, or TIP or CN project, as I mentioned, also call it orchestration stream there, actually do a great job in actually bringing those implementation based on standards but open source implementations into the market. So those are also, both play the role of the first showcases to actually show to industry that works by standard, but also they can potentially make a basis for the new products which come out of that. Now, it is very important to emphasize that open source do not produce product themselves. They produce functionality. Some vendor would need to package it to make it product level, to aid, security, scalability, resiliency, and so on. But eventually, the work which is being done, if vendor takes it and package it into product, those products would actually serve the market. And this is definitely what we are doing in Linux Foundation and in TIP. Now, I would really like to touch one point asked before about monetization and what would be the charging. I think really it is about B2B2C model where, the service provider and enterprise, both sides care less about specific consumer belonging to the enterprise and how much that consumer used and which application he used. It is really much more about observed service experience for all of the consumers or subscribers getting that service, and about really the consumption of service, consumption of those slices by enterprises. And this is why the new monetization model, as the one that I've mentioned at the beginning, where actually charging is being done by consumption and not by volume time events of a singular mobile session, is really something which can help service providers and enterprises on both sides. And we are also pushing it in the corresponding standardization budgets, in this example, 3GPP, and in Amdocs, as I work for Amdocs, we also implement it by a communication between our OSS layer and BSS layer.
Thank you, Alla. And I've got a question here from Nindi Pandey, and it actually builds on what you're talking about in terms of charging and how that goes along. And I'll throw it out to the panel. It says, as of now, quality of service, QoS, is maintained via subscriber policies and presumably by subscriber subscriptions. Do we see these going away or working in tandem with network slicing to deliver differentiated experiences for the masses? Or is network slicing more relevant in the B2B space?
I think it is really, sorry.
Go ahead, Alla. Yeah.
Okay, I think it is really complementary. I think the existing model will continue because slicing is not for enterprises only. So if we talk about the consumer market, definitely there is a space, and those models of charging of subscriber per subscriber consumption in terms of volume and time events, it will definitely continue. But speaking of enterprise and the business relationship between service provider and enterprise, that may be less relevant. So those new models I'm just talking about will come into the play. But I really believe that both will coexist. It is not that one will replace another.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. I mean, it's we're inventing a lot of constructs because of, there was a number of things that happened around about the same time as 5G became a kind of a headline act to cover a whole range of technologies, and one of them was softwarisation of the networks, which enables this concept of being able to first of all move network functions around within the network, which in turn allows them to deliver different levels of quality of service and quality of experience for different applications. But also it allows you to do this partitioning that we've been talking about in terms of network slicing. And immediately you give a network that capability, the level of differentiation in terms of what the quality of service is and how that translates into quality of experience for any customer, enterprise or consumer, it opens up a whole range of new ways of doing things. Notwithstanding Alla's point around the potential for a much more simplified model of charging when it comes to enterprise customers. I think that is a real catalyst, and it's certainly what enterprise customers are looking for. But they're looking to pay for a service which is good enough to deliver each of the individual applications that they want, and each of those individual applications may have fundamentally different KPIs associated with them. If you translate that into the enterprise, into the consumer market, that could be a very powerful model, which then allows you to essentially give people integrate or differentiation within their single consumer contract for different applications or different service types. They may not see that differentiation; they may just feel it as better quality of experience across the board. But that, in turn, potentially drives additional revenue streams.
So just to build on that, Dan, I think what you're saying, if I've understood it correctly, is that we may not charge for individual slices or individual functions, but the collective experience or the collective service that you're going to deliver to the customer is something that they'll be prepared to pay for. And that will be underpinned by the guaranteed services that 5G networks, network slicing, and network as a service can deliver. And I think, Doug, that sort of builds on the concept that you have within the Dublin City scenario, where you're offering services to the citizens and you're not charging the citizens for the individual services, but the overall experience that you're giving to the citizens is actually improved by the technology that's providing the service, by the network slicing or by the network as a service capabilities. And that then is something that either enriches the lives of the citizens or reduces cost of delivery of those services by such things as smart car parking or whatever. That means you get a more effective utilization of your resources. So are you saying that that's the journey that we need to take on, the need to take whenever we talk about 5G monetization? Think about the end customer and think about the services that we deliver to them, and let others worry about the detailed technology of the 5G capabilities of network services and slices.
Yeah, I do believe that. And, we don't talk about monetizing some of these services. But the truth is, we spend a lot of time on quality of life, quality of experience, as you have described. And what that does is it makes the city of Dublin a higher quality environment, which translates into eventually higher quality of revenue that we get. We have better economic development, and these things follow. They're secondary and tertiary kinds of things. And tagging on to the conversation we've just had, um, quality of service, there has emerged a good stability in networks, that quality of service doesn't go away, but it just becomes part of the service itself is more of the orchestration. So the industry needs to make it easier for me, as the leader of a technology enterprise, to deliver these services. And that is the service you're delivering to me, and it is a product. And I really like what Alla was saying about being more consumption oriented. So it's our job to, and sometimes we benchmark on a Disney World or something like that, that they're consistently working on. As soon as you enter the environment, your experience is orchestrated and very much cared about. And if you do it right, then people will come more often. They'll spend money in your restaurants. They will essentially become your customers. So we very much concern ourselves with that, but it's not a direct that we say, hey, we made parking a lot easier, we reduced traffic congestion, and we made you safer at night. That's going to cost you this amount. Rather, people recognize that intrinsically without even defining it, and will reward you with a better situation.
Doug, thank you very much. And that's a fantastic note for us to finish on. For those that are sitting as operators or vendors into this space, you heard it from the end B or the end C in the business or the customer. Make your services easier for them to consume, and they will use them. Doug wants to deliver an experience to his citizens, and that's what it's all about. So to Greg, Doug, Alla, and Dan, thank you very much for a very engaging conversation this morning, and I will hand back to Sasha in the studio.
George, thank you very much.